and welcome to this home edition of Politics Today. And in this programme, we will be discussing state versus the church and how a ruling in Scotland has declared that Nicola Sturgeon's policy decision to close churches during the pandemic was unlawful and unconstitutional. I'm joined in this programme today by Tim Dieppe from Christian Concern, as well as David Curtin from the Heritage Party, who's also standing for the mayoral elections in London. I'll start off with you, David. How's your campaign going so far, and when do you think the campaign to be the next mayor of London will really start to kick off?
Yeah, it's going well, actually. We spent a lot of time in March getting the nomination papers done. You need to get an awful lot of signatures, and it's a lot of work to do just to get on the ballot paper. But now that's done, I think things are starting to kick off now because we're actually into the pre-election period proper. So restrictions have been lifted a little bit. Up until the 8th of March, the government was saying you're not even allowed to stick leaflets through the door. So no one could do any campaigning whatsoever. But now we can. I'm doing a lot of campaigning actually online. It's very, very different this time because of the restrictions, and I don't agree with the restrictions at all. But obviously, I don't want to get any people in trouble who are campaigning for me. So we're putting leaflets out, but we're doing a lot of things, making some videos, and it's going well. So I think people resonate with the message of freedom that the Heritage Party is bringing, and we need to open up London. We need to end politically correct policing and get the police doing their real jobs rather than doing things like arresting people for sitting on a park bench, or, as we saw the other day, closing down a church service.
No, absolutely. And Tim, it's great that you can join us on this home edition of Politics Today. Can you share with us this historic judgment that occurred on the 24th of March this year, 2021, that declared that the Scottish Government's decision to close the churches was unlawful and unconstitutional?
Yeah, well, thank you, Simon. It's great to be on the programme again. Listen, this judgment that we had just late last month is actually a very, very significant historic judgment. It basically says that the government was wrong to criminalise Christian worship, and it was unlawful to do so. And this is something we've been concerned about right from the beginning of this whole crisis. Back in June last year, a bunch of church leaders across England sent a letter and legal letter to the government saying we want to challenge this decision to criminalise worship. We're particularly concerned about this point, making it illegal to gather to worship God. You're allowed to go to an off license, you're allowed to go to a bicycle shop, various other things were deemed essential, but Christian ministry was like criminalized. And what made it even worse was you can carry out secular activities in church, like food banks or vaccination centers or something like that. But if you were to pray, my goodness, you'd be breaking the law. If you were to do an act of worship, you'd be breaking the law. And this is what was really wrong and clearly an overreach and clearly an overstep in terms of what the governments did. And of course, back in last year, just as it was about to go to court, the government allowed churches to open again. And then we had a sort of back and forth with a lockdown in Wales and some Welsh leaders wanting to challenge that. And then a further lockdown in November, and a whole much larger group of church leaders came together to challenge that. Each time the government opened churches just before it could get to legal action. And then in Scotland, they closed churches in January. And again, we got together a bunch of 27 Scottish church leaders to challenge this decision. And of course, what was also odd about this one was that churches were allowed to open, have been allowed to open in England and Wales since January, but in Scotland they weren't. And the Scottish government kindly kept the churches closed right through to the end of March so that the case could go to court. And it went to court, and as you said, Simon, on both grounds. So one is constitution, and the other is European human rights. On both grounds, the judge ruled that the government had acted unlawfully in criminalising Christian worship. Very significant judgments. First of all, he agreed that they'd criminalised Christian worship. He agreed that the petitioners could not practice their worship as they're supposed to. Of course, the government tried to argue, no, it's not that bad because they can worship online. And the judge said, no, that's not the same. That's not what these people count as worship. In fact, perhaps I'll read from the judgment. He said, "For all these reasons, I'm clear that the effective closure of places of worship is that the petitioners and the additional party are effectively prevented from practicing or manifesting their religion, however many broadcasts or internet platforms may exist." Right? So he's very, very clear. Internet, virtual church is not real church. Right? He said it effectively in those words in the judgment. Stronger than many churches are actually saying it today. Isn't that interesting? And said that therefore you clearly have breached their constitutional rights and breached their human rights as well. And then he looked at the Constitution. Another sort of interesting aspect of this judgment was it provided some education, I think, for politicians and for lawyers, because they didn't realize what the Constitution said. And our council sort of referred back to various different constitutional acts that clearly state that the church is separate from the state. The state shouldn't interfere with the church, right? And so the judge referred back to General Assembly Act 1592, Confession of Faith Ratification Act 1690, the Acts for Securing the Protestant Religion 1706, Union with Scotland Act 1706, the Union with England Act 1707, which guarantees for Scotland for all time coming the independence of its church. And then the Church of Scotland Act in 1921, which also says that the state can't interfere with the church. And this is a great lesson. The doctrine of two kingdoms is cited in this judgment, saying you can't have the state interfering in the church. You can't have the state telling the church what they can and cannot do. And the government lawyers actually agreed with that. They said, yes, we agree, we can't do any of that. But they tried to argue that closing churches wasn't interfering with the church. And the judge wasn't agreeing with that. And it came down to proportionality, both in the case of the constitutional argument and the European human rights argument. And the judge basically said, look, if you're going to allow bicycle shops to open, off license to open, jury service in cinemas, then you've got to allow churches to open as well. You can't sort of say that churches are less important. The Article 9 on European Convention of Human Rights, which is freedom of religion and belief, is very, very significant. It's very important, and governments can't just ignore it. And so as a result of this judgment, I think governments in England, Scotland, and Wales and all now will find it very, very hard to close churches again. We've set a precedent here. If we have a third wave, a fourth wave, a fifth wave, whatever, they will find it very difficult to close churches. And so we've actually set something in legal precedent here that says church worship is important, and churches can't just be closed, and particularly you can't criminalize Christian worship. And I think that's a historic, very important thing that will hopefully stand for generations, decades and generations in this nation.
Absolutely. So great work there by Christian Concern and the Christian Legal Council as well, because it's so important. And David, who would have thought that prior to this COVID-19 pandemic, that would actually be a criminal offence to actually attend church? And it just really shows, I think, the attitude of the government, the attitude of, for example, the First Minister and the national assemblies across the European kingdom, when it actually comes to the practice of faith and freedom of religion. What do you think?
This would have been inconceivable, just over a year ago, that people would have thought that governments, the Westminster government, and also then the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Senedd would have acted to close down churches and making worship illegal, and then saying, oh, but it's okay, but you can go online and join an online service, because clearly that, as Tim just said, that is not the same thing at all. I mean, Christians need to go and worship together, singing hymns and being together, and in worship is part of the Christian faith, as it is for other faiths as well, and that should never have been criminalized. So it is an indictment on the political class that they have put that last in their order of priorities, and safeguarding the right to worship, the right to assemble, which we've had in our constitution and as part of our fundamental freedoms for centuries and centuries, that they are just trying to overturn those things to bring in something new, some new system. And they're saying this is temporary, but I worry that looking at the trajectory they're going on, they want to try to make some of these things permanent. So what Christian Concern, the Christian Legal Center, and their allies did in bringing the case is absolutely heroic, and I think we all owe a debt of gratitude to them for bringing the case and making sure that this judgment happened, that says that banning worship is actually illegal and unconstitutional. So that was this is something that I think people are not reporting on much in the mainstream media, but the ramifications of this for freedom are immense, and they are to be wholly celebrated.
Absolutely. And Janice Scott QC, representing the 27 Scottish churches, actually come up with this very interesting quote in which she says that the pandemic has highlighted an irreconcilable conflict for the church leaders, a choice between obeying the state and God. Are we coming to that time where there is a stark choice for Christians to make in the West, in Britain and around and particularly in Western Europe as well? Is it a choice of first obeying the state or obeying God? And now we're starting to see this real conflict emerge, particularly over the Scottish governments and also the English and Welsh and Northern Ireland government of actually closing churches during this pandemic.
Yes, so I think that this is how these church leaders felt. Like, they can't obey what the state has said in conscience, given what the Bible says about let us not give up meeting together. Given that, we're just adding to what David Curtin said, though, you also have to lay hands on people, baptize people, administer the bread and the wine and things. You can't do these things virtually. You can't do all these things virtually, right? So, you can do some things virtually. I'm grateful for the technology, but ultimately meeting together and worshiping together can't really be done virtually in a biblical way. And therefore, these churches are saying you're violating our consciences by saying that we can't meet here. And obviously, I do know that some churches continue to meet in certain circumstances through this crisis with different responses from the police. Some of them might have managed to get away with it. Others had police turn up with riot gear, and others had police gently warning them or whatever, or coming to a compromise or whatever, something like that. But again, this is, then the scenes of the police interfering in a church in Wales, I think, caused the Welsh government to say to the police, stop interfering with worship, just let them work, just don't worry about it. Because it's a shocking thing to think of the police interfering with church worship. We sort of used to hearing from it in China or in North Korea or very oppressive states like that. And here we are today, and we've seen it in the UK in the last year and even in the last week on Good Friday with this church in London where the police went and interfered there as well. And so, here we are. Who would have imagined it more than a year ago that police would be going into churches saying you can't meet, go home, stop worshipping God. Who would have imagined that would have happened? But it has happened here in the UK. It's set a precedent that's dangerous. I think this legal judgment is a big setback to that, and hopefully will stop it from happening again and prevent it from happening again. But governments need to learn the lesson from it and recognise it and see it for what it is. And of course, another challenge that it looks like it might be coming down the road is vaccine passports. Will the government insist that churches sort of only admit people who've got a vaccine passport or something like that? And what would churches do in that situation? I saw a very entertaining satire about churches should have leprosy passports, because leprosy is a very dangerous infectious disease. You don't want to pass it on, and the worst thing you want to do is be a bad witness about this kind of thing. This is where it looks like, doesn't it? I hope that doesn't happen. I mean, I think that probably there'll be enough opposition to it not to happen, but you can see the pressure for it that's happening, and as people are scared of this virus and scared of passing it on, so on.
And David, there's been no attempt to actually close churches in Scotland since the persecution of the Presbyterian Church instigated by the Stuart kings back in the 17th century. And there seems to be that we're living in a time now where our leaders have become so godless, so secular, that there isn't any kind of reverence towards God at all. And the fact that they actually thought that they could close churches and make it a criminal offence just shows you how out of touch these leaders are. And particularly in the time when we've had this pandemic, that the church and national prayer intercession and seeking God is the most important thing any government could institute at this time, particularly if we look back historically to what happened during the Second World War.
Yeah, absolutely. In the Second World War, the king instituted a national day of prayer when the troops were stuck in Dunkirk, and then they got back safely. So there you go. The results of that national day of prayer are there. We rescued our troops. If you can see that, but this time, there's no call for any kind of prayer from any leaders, whether they're in the royal family or parliamentarians or people in the government. They say that they are against the persecution of Christians. The other day, Dominic Raab put out a tweet about Christians being persecuted around the world. But the irony of that is that now Christians are being persecuted in the United Kingdom. As you say, the first time that worship has been closed down since the 18th century in Scotland. And the other day, on Good Friday, we saw a Polish Catholic church being closed down in the middle of a mass in Balham in South London. And I think people around the world were absolutely disgusted at that. And the excuse the police used were not everybody's wearing masks. Well, I don't agree with that. But even under the current regulations, you don't have to wear a mask if you're exempt. And they said, oh, people aren't all social distancing. Again, I don't agree with that. But if you are in a family group, you don't have to social distance. And the priest there says, well, we were obeying all of the regulations, but they got closed down and shut down anyway by the Metropolitan Police. So you've got this victory in Scotland, but still in England, you've got police force is going and closing down churches. So we need more action in England as well. I'm not sure of the exact legal situation in Wales. I think they've pulled back from closing down churches. As you said, there were incidents before which were shocking, but the legal situation needs to be clarified. And I think some people in government were actually salivating at the idea of this, because there are actually some aggressive secularists, and secularism is, it's all usually seen and presented as being some kind of neutral tabula rasa, blank tablet that everyone can sort of be play a part in society. But actually, there is an aggressive secularism which is tied in with aggressive humanism that actually wants to remove any kind of faith, particularly Christianity, from the public sphere. So people who are aggressive secularists and humanists would want to, for example, close down church schools, disestablish the Church of England, and would be very, very happy to have churches closed for our safety, as it were, because of the reaction to the pandemic. We need to call this out, and I think more Christian leaders need to start calling this out and fighting for the rights of Christians and for churches to stay open, as Tim and the Christian Concern and the Christian Legal Centre have done in Scotland.
And Tim, I have to really, I suppose, pose this very important question: is that Christians don't use law lightly, do they? And also the QC defending the 27 Christian churches up in Scotland testified to this fact, that this is the kind of last resort for Christians to take action against the state in order to defend our Christian freedoms. And here we have 27 Scottish church leaders taking action together with the Christian Legal Centre. Is law the last resort that we should use as Christians against the state in order to protect our Christian freedoms?
Well, yes, sadly it is. Sadly, when it comes to the state saying, you can't gather to worship, you can't gather to share communion, or you can't gather to pray or whatever, then you're going to have to go to law and say, well, hang on a minute, where is your basis for this? Is this really what you're authorized to do? And fortunately, we have a system in this country where the law overrides whoever you are, and even governments have to obey the law. And sadly, the governments didn't realize how much they were overstepping their authority in actually criminalizing, making it a criminal offense to gather to worship the living God. I mean, it can't be overstated how significant that was. It was a criminal offense to have a prayer meeting. It was a criminal offense to gather to worship God. They sadly, they did that and thought that they were fine to do that, and they weren't. And it needed to be challenged. And yes, it's a last resort. Yes, you want to talk first. You want to discuss it first. You want to try to save them first. We tried all that, but ultimately we had to go to law. And ultimately, fortunately, by the grace of God, in this case, the judge said clearly that the government had acted unlawfully, and so therefore the governments had to back down. The judge said immediately churches should be open. Okay, so when churches were already open in England and Wales and were just about to open in Scotland, so it didn't have that much dramatic effect at the time. But the point was made immediately: this is wrong. You've got to backtrack. You've got to change this and not do this again. And I think that the governments will learn their lesson from that. They can't just go and do this again and realize that they've breached an important principle. And sometimes you do have to go to law to show this. I mean, that this is, even Paul appealed to his legal rights, didn't he, in the New Testament, when he said, I'm a Roman citizen, you can't just let me off like this. You have to publicly apologize. You shouldn't have treated me like this. And so they did. They made a public apology. And sometimes this is what we need to do, is go to law in order to achieve justice, in order to set a precedent, in order to show that somebody's been mistreated, and in order to protect future people and future generations and future churches from being treated in the same way. And this is a big part of what we try and do at Christian Concern.
And David, I think we are increasingly seeing, aren't we, now that there is such a huge, I say it's huge chasm, really, essentially, between our Christian beliefs and those led by very progressive liberal governments in the West, whether it's the Biden administration in the States or whether it's our government here in the UK. There seems to be a complete lack of reverence for God. So as Christians, and particularly as you are a leading member of the London Assembly, how vital is it that we sometimes go against the state in order to do what's right biblically and what's right before God, when we see the clash between our Christian beliefs and those of the state?
Yeah, it's absolutely vital. But there's a huge tension within Christianity, because we're told to obey the law because those people are put there by God to administer justice and keep order. But then we're also told to obey God rather than men. That's what Paul said. And, and when there is the concept of a law being repugnant, legally repugnant to our human rights and our fundamental freedoms. And my view is that a lot of these emergency laws that are brought in on the back of the coronavirus are legally repugnant because they are trashing our civil liberties. We're talking about, in the context of church, making worship and the right to go to church, the right to assemble to worship. They're making those illegal and a criminal offense. I consider those legally repugnant and wholly disproportionate to the situation that we have. So, taking legal action then pushes back legally. We get into tricky ground when we start talking about civil disobedience, but we're almost halfway there to being like China, where churches are illegal. If you want to worship God without being in one of the controlled Communist Party churches, you have to break the law and meet illegally in an underground church. Now, I would absolutely support all of those brave and courageous Christians in China who are risking their lives and their freedom to go and worship God. What they're doing is illegal, under Chinese Communist Party law, but they are obeying God's law in gathering as the saints to worship God. We are on that road in this country. And I think there is a case for saying that there comes a point where we have to say, what are we going to obey these people in government that are saying you must give up your faith and any kind of outward practice of your faith and just sit online at home, or are we going to obey God and meet as churches in the underground? I think there's a case to make that we need that kind of civil disobedience if the government continues to bring in these laws which are legally repugnant to our fundamental freedoms.
Absolutely, David. And Tim, we're down to the last 2 minutes of the program, so I kind of need to sum up, really. Congratulations with the incredible work being done by the Christian Legal Centre and also these 27 church leaders up in Scotland for overturning the Scottish government's decision to close churches and make it a criminal offence on the grounds that this was unconstitutional and unlegal. But going forward, as Christians, and particularly our viewers watching this program today, do we need to prepare ourselves to reach a time where we obey God rather than the state? Because we're seeing that these progressive liberal ideas are formulating in a kind of stronger measure which oppose our biblical values. And as Christians, do we need to start to prepare ourselves to move against the state?
Well, I think we need to start teaching about these things and discussing these things, looking at the church in China, for example, that David just been talking about, looking at examples from church history as well, and seeing where the line gets crossed, between submission to the authorities and disobeying God. The sort of rule of thumb is where the government commands something that Jesus forbids, that the Bible forbids, or forbids something the Bible commands, then you have grounds for disobeying the state. And here we are, the government commanded not to meet together, which the Bible clearly says you should do. I think there was grounds there for basically disobeying the government on that one, and I think there would be in future if that happened. And the Chinese Christians would do that every week, as we've just been hearing. And I think we need to start preparing by teaching about this and discussing it and talking about it and deciding what is church, to what extent does virtual church really count or not as church? How long are we prepared not to meet in person before we decide we're not really a church anymore, or not to take the sacraments, or not to baptize, or not to lay hands on people, or all these various things? And to what extent can we hide away, and to what extent do we go and be public about it, and to what extent are we secret, and to what extent are we out there and boldly deciding, listen, we are unashamedly obeying Jesus rather than man. And these things need to be talked about and discussed and prayed about. And I hope that we don't get there, but as David says, this is the trajectory at the moment. And who would have said, I mean, if somebody had said to me, honestly, 18 months ago, Christian worship would be criminalized, I would have said you're a complete nutcase. I would have never believed it, honestly, and it has happened. Now, I hope it won't happen ever again. Now, I hope this judgment has laid that to rest for many generations. But we shall see. There is many other pressures coming on churches, family values pressures as well, coming on churches as well. And so, it may come to it again in terms of whether we obey the government or the state.
So, Tim and David, thank you so much for being my guests on this home edition of Politics Today. And I want to thank you for watching this program.